Well, I've always been drawing since I was a little kid, but it wasn't comics that got me drawing. I played a lot of video games, and I didn't really necessarily have all the video games that my friends had. Like, my era was like the Nintendo 64 had just come out, and people were getting PlayStation 1s and 2s, and I'm the youngest of four, and so I didn't have those consoles, and I had to buy a Super Nintendo from my oldest brother.
Oh,
uh, and essentially I played Super Nintendo like into like my high school years, and so I just got really like I absorbed all like the artwork, like all the Mario Brother games and Zelda games, and I had the little manuals and I had art, and I learned how to draw from those manuals and from cartoons that I would watch. And so I didn't really know comics until like my dad started giving me like the comic strips in the newspaper, and then he also gave me there was like those like daily tearaway calendars, like they had one for the Far Side cartoons by Gary Larson, and like that was my first comic book actually. It was like a tearaway calendar. And then my brothers would get Mad Magazine, and like there'd be like Sergio Aragones, was like one of my like favorite Mexican cartoonists. Uh, like I didn't realize I was reading comics. It looked like a magazine with a lot of funny stories inside it,
yeah.
and I didn't really decide to get too serious with comics until maybe um, around middle school. I started making friends who were doing like online competitions. Like Enter Void is if you ever heard of it, it's like a forum. It's a community where like people create OCs and they challenge each other to like fights, and so they do comics detailing those fights, and people vote on certain criterias. And
Gotcha.
so my friend Lucky got me into that. And then after that in high school, I had friends who like Marvel and DC, and I wanted to be different. And
Yeah.
so I was like, oh, well, I like the Hellboy movies. Maybe Hellboy is something I'd get into. And I fell in love with Hellboy. I started collect. Those were the only comics I really collect are the Hellboy comics. And then um, after high school, I started getting into alternative comics, indie comics, like Daniel Klaus. So reading Ghost World was probably one of the first indie comics I read. And essentially, the whole world of what comics could be really opened up um, when I was reading. Like I collect like the best American comic collections. Those are some of the first books I read after high school, and that essentially you get introduced to so many different artists.
I bet. I mean, it must be overwhelming.
Like some of the books that really stuck out to me was Day Tripper by Gabriel Ba and Fabio Moon. Like that's one of the best books that like I've gifted 6 copies of that book so far. Every time I'll rebuy that copy for myself, and then when somebody is going through a change in their life or they're moving away, I always gift them that book because it's just that incredible. And so I actually just gave one away last week, so I have to buy another copy of Day
That's
Tripper.
so cool. I mean, I would
Uh,
love to do that as well with like influential works that I enjoy and just giving it to my
yeah,
friends. I love that you do that.
yeah, I think it's special. I think yeah, graphic novels and comics. It's just a great medium to really um, just expand people's minds and expose them to so many different things. So I read them. I actually read more comics back then than I do now. I didn't start getting serious about like really serious about wanting to actually focus on comics till 2019, like right before the pandemic. So in between that time, between high school and me getting full time into comics, I had studied design. That's my background professionally: graphic design, motion design, and I spent 3 years in college not really doing much art. So there's this big. I have every sketchbook I ever drew since I was a little kid, and then all that art stops right before college. So as I'm like 22, 23, there's no real art between that and when I was 25, 26. And so essentially I felt uninspired. The design work is great because like it's a big industry here in the Bay Area in California, and so like there was always work, but like it was creatively draining because you're not doing work for yourself. We're doing work for a tech company or a marketing company,
Yeah.
and I got laid off from my one of my first jobs after college, and I was kind of stressing out about like, I had my apartment and I was going to lose my apartment if I didn't have another job, and so I was more focused on trying to find another design job than really doing art or the stuff that I really wanted to do. And then my mom was all like, "You should just move back." And I'm very fortunate that I have family.
Yeah.
I have a lot of family close by, and again, I'm the youngest of four, and so like I was really supportive with my family, and so I moved back. I went on unemployment, and then that's when I decided like it just again like talking about like big life changes and how comics can really fit into that.
Yeah.
I decided like I'm gonna try to get serious about comics, and that was
Mhm.
2019. And so I started doing a lot of shorts. I started posting more and more art on Instagram, and little shorts, a little because you can do the swiping comics, so you can only really do 10 swipes at a time
Yeah.
on Instagram. So I was just doing stuff like that, and I was working with friends. I had my friend Gabriel Tiburcio. He's a writer,
Mhm.
and he had this beautiful poem that I turned into a comic. I said, "Hey, could I use this as inspiration?" And that was a 3 pager, one of my favorite works, like full color. I did a lot of research, a lot of sketching, and then I was asked to do contribute to Laserzine, which is done by Alex Sodari here in Oakland, and I did a 5 page comic. Actually, I worked on that first, and they delayed the printing of that because of the pandemic. But essentially, 5 2 page comics. That's like the most I had ever done.
Yeah.
And then I was reconnecting with a lot of old comic friends I knew before I started college, and one of them was Michael Sweater and Benji Nate. And I reached out to them on Instagram. I was like, "Hey, I don't know if you guys remember me, but we used to talk, and I used to really love your work. I have a lot of their old comics." And just reconnecting like that and talking to other comics people. And then Michael reaches out and says, "Hey, I have an idea for a comic that I think you'd be great for." And it was kind of before it was Puppy Night. It was actually going to be about mice, and
Oh.
yeah, it was kind of, and so like I was kind of okay, cool, this sounds cool. And then he showed me Puppy Night. He showed me the first sketches, and then he showed me this idea for like a book, this big book,
Yeah.
and it was going to be like 200 pages.
Wow. Oh my
And
God.
going from 5 pages to like agreeing to do 200 pages, like Michael Sweater, like really makes you believe that you can do the things that you can do. And so like he said, if you think you can do it, let's do it. And I was like, sure. And then I've told the story a lot before, but once Mike presented the story and script to Avi Elric from the publisher of Silver Sprocket, they were like, no, like you've never worked this many pages. This is kind of like biting off more than you can chew. Let's
Yeah.
start with something smaller. And so like they were still down to have us do a story together. But the 200 pages is like, and it's fair. Like when you're working in publishing, like you can get screwed over because people will commit to these big projects, and you might pay them like big advances, and they don't accomplish
Yeah.
the book.
I can
And
imagine.
so yeah, so there's risk being taken there.
Mhm.
So uh, the book obviously said do 48 pages, and I'm like, okay, that sounds great. And like I don't know, like again, like this is my first time. This is back in 2020. Yeah, I suppose maybe. I'm really bad with timelines, but
Oh, especially with the
um,
pandemic, it's all kind of like a
yes,
blur.
it's all very fuzzy. But essentially like Michael's always very motivating, and so like he's just been a great person to work with, and so like he probably could have like really made me like got me to work out those 200 pages somehow,
Yeah.
but 48 pages is always a good start. What I've told other people who also asked me questions about like, oh, I have this great idea for a comic that I really want to start off, and this is the first project they're jumping into. I'd say if you want to shoot for it, go for it. Like you should just go for it. But just so you know, like skill takes time to develop, and like your workflow takes time to develop. And if you're getting frustrated when your book doesn't look how you want it to look at the very start, it's because you're just starting. And it's
Right.
fine to start uh, from very minimal experienced, and then just grow. And then it's really cool to see when people's comics just develop and improve and change and grow. Like if you look at One Piece, page one of One Piece looks completely different from the whatever millionth page it's on right now.
Right.
So that's really cool to see. But I
Hmm.
do see a lot of people not starting the work because they're too focused on getting everything right for their perfect story.
Hmm.
And I guess what I learned from my experience is like it's okay to start with small batches. And I think
Yeah.
that helps build the skills out so that you just, you're still putting out work. You're not stopping yourself waiting for the perfect time to start this story. You're just making comics. So
Of course.
we got the first book done, Puppy Night, Then a Deception. And then Michael Sweater works with an agent, and
Hmm.
that's also how he's gotten work. And uh, the agency is gosh, I'm blanking on the name, but essentially, like they shopped our book around, and we started getting some offers. And one of the offers that like we decided to accept was from Union Square Kids, which is, I believe it's the publishing arm of Barnes and Noble.
Okay.
But they reached out and they said we want to do 3 books, and now we're working on that first original 200 page
Yeah,
book.
so eventually you will end up drawing the
Yes,
200. And that's so
yeah.
funny because I
So
feel like sometimes you need that influence or that friend who pushes you to do things that you don't believe that you yourself can
yes,
do. But then you also need that kind of pulling back or realistic expectation of, hey, you've never done this amount of pages.
yes.
Maybe scale it down a little bit.
So that's exactly what it's like, because one of the biggest benefits for me when I started getting into comics is just meeting people in comics, making
Hmm.
friends, collaborating with people, talking to people. Like community is such a big part. Community is also rough because like, you meet some of the best people and some of the worst people, and you
Yes.
just kind of have to, stand your ground and go with your convictions. And essentially like you just have to expect that like you're rubbing elbows with everybody, and the community is fairly relatively small in the
Hmm.
sense that like comics do take time, and people, it's a threshold that people don't um uh, that people will walk away from because it gets hard. Like I can imagine the animation industry is also a much smaller,
Yeah.
relatively smaller community because you're drawing even more little pictures in animation.
Oh my God,
But
yes.
you're completely right about like essentially you have friends that'll push you to be like, hey, you can totally do this, and then you have the real like editorial or maybe somebody outside of comics that you're like, hey, can you read my book and tell me what you think? You have that person to like the kind of it's like create the creative aspect with the versus the
Maybe business side of things or
business,
yeah.
editorial, or like realism, like
Yeah. Pulling
how
you
does
to
this
the
actually
ground.
apply to the real world, right?
Yes.
Because you can always share comics with other comics people, and you'll have one conversation, but when you share comics with non-comics people, it's a completely different thing, and you want everyone to be able to read your stuff.
Right.
So you have to also like be ready to hear that kind of feedback and be prepared for a little bit more pushback, because you don't always just want to hear the nicest things in the world. You don't always want to
Yeah.
hear what you want to hear. You want to kind of understand how your work fits in other areas of readers and people.
Right.
But that
Well,
brings us to now. So now
yeah.
I'm just working on that 200-page book.
And now you're doing what you initially set out to do
Yeah, so
with
I'm working on
Michael.
this full time. And essentially, I'll be working on these books for the next 2, 3 years.
Hmm.
We can get to this whole other conversation later, but like I do want to go back to design just because like the money in design is so much greater than the money in like arts,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So it's kind of one of those things of like my wife 100% supports me, and I'm really thankful for that. Again, like and I'll premise this like I feel like I have it so much easier than other people, and I do want to let people know because like you hear somebody like with a come up story, and yes, there's hard work put into it, but it's also good to know like what are the circumstances that led to this. And
Right.
like I had family, I have friends, and my wife, and every one of them I thank, and I couldn't do any of this without that support. Some people like they're either far from family, or they're don't have as big of a support network, and like they still make it work. And I just want to be very mindful that like my experience is so much more different, and I had a lot of help.
Yeah, I love that you're mentioning this because I do think it's important, especially for people that are just coming into the industry or coming into the world of comics, to realize that some people have different advantages over other people. Some people have some privilege that other people won't have. And so you can't expect things to go the same
Yeah,
way for everybody.
yeah,
And especially in such a small community,
yeah,
right? Everybody's story is completely different from one
yeah.
another. I would really love to get your opinion on like what you personally think is the best way to approach starting a graphic novel project or a comic project.
Yeah. I can't say I'm much of a writer. I do think, so my background again is in design, and a lot of what I picked up from, uh, my time studying design is that, you just have to make sure what you're communicating is clear, and the artistry, gets added onto it, to, if you're I deal with a lot of metaphors when I'm doing short comics, but first and foremost you have to make sure people can tell what you're trying to say. Like, if you're same thing with drawing, if you're trying to draw a dog, you have to, and you don't have to be the best artist in the world, it doesn't have to be realistic, but if you know the shapes that form the semblance of a dog and people can read it, that's the important thing. So what I would tell people first and foremost if they're starting a comic is just, make sure that, you're being clear, with what you're trying to represent. I've worked with some people who reached out to me asking for like advice about like the comic they're working on, and like, the story will be there, but like it would be like, hey, just so you know, like you might need to, um, make sure that, what you're drawing, like sometimes, you want to draw everything in the world, but all you really need is the one thing to get your idea across.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm trying to, say is like, always start small with the most basic ideas, and then, you can start elaborating with them. So given that I'm not a writer, I would suggest I always block out my stories, with post-it notes,
Hmm.
and like, you can be blocking out your story beats, if you don't like working with scripts. Michael also doesn't, work with, much script. He basically starts drawing out the story.
Yeah.
But it's like starting small. Um, you don't want to do like overdeveloped thumbnails. You basically like, you want to be as loose as you can, because you can do so much editing at the very beginning. That way, when you're deep in it, you're not necessarily tearing out pages or reworking panels, and it's so much harder to steer the ship, when you're out in the water, than if you're prepared
Yeah.
ahead of time. You're basically drawing your course, right?
Every like I said, everybody's process is different, and actually, I think it's really valuable to get different perspectives on it, even if you're not or you don't consider yourself a writer, right?
I can show you, actually.
But from the strips that I've seen that you've made, I would consider you a storyteller for sure. So,
Oh, thank you. I actually have a really good example here.
oh,
So
awesome.
here's how, one of my stories goes uh, from here, to here. So essentially, when the idea strikes, I'm not great at telling my brain when to start thinking of good idea. So whenever I'm in the shower or I'm walking alone, usually my brain will start to think of something. And if I have something to write it down quickly, it's like you're trying to capture lightning in a bottle. It's not ideal, but it's just how my brain works.
Yeah.
But post-it notes are essentially like, I write out the whole story on these post-it notes as it's kind of coming out into my brain. And then once that's done, the thumbnail, kind of happens. This is a really big thumbnail, but, you can work much smaller. It's often easier to work much smaller too. But I just kind of already had a vision for how I wanted this to work. And then after you have kind of all the beats together, you can rearrange or you can cut out much easier at this stage than you could much later. And then I have, yeah, I love process. That's probably my favorite part of making
I
comics.
can see that. I was actually going to ask you what your process is, but since you're already telling it to us, I'm just like absorbing it
Yeah,
all.
but I'll show you. Trying to find the exact pencils for the page that I wanted to show you. Yeah, I don't have the best filing system, but anyways, I have all the pencils and stuff for my story spacewalk here.
Nice.
So I don't normally do too much inking just because the Puppy Night, it's such a big book. I do it all digital.
Mhm.
But whenever I have the time, I like to draw traditionally. And then I put I put the pencils on a light box, and then I'll ink over it on a different sheet
Nice.
of paper to preserve the pencils and the ink. I think just being able to like, yeah, I'll always start small. Um, I don't like to throw away ideas. I write them down. I jot down. I keep, even if like this story, I I was thinking about it of doing something like this like maybe a year before I officially started putting pen to paper.
Gotcha.
So sometimes you'll find there are times when like maybe an idea or an emotion for a story, uh, you might lose that feeling uh, after you have the idea, or maybe even in the middle of making the comic, you might lose the motivating force. And I don't think it's bad to step away from it, because you can always come back to it.
Right.
I think the worst thing you can do for yourself is to force yourself to kind of like force yourself to create when your mind and body wants to do something else,
Yeah.
and it's infuriating because sometimes you feel like you're not making progress on something, but like honestly, like I think banging your head against like a wall is not going to help the final product. And one of the things that I definitely learned on my journey is like give the thing that you're working on the time that it needs. Of course, deadlines are always real.
Yeah.
I'm learning to do more shortcuts, but if you're doing something for yourself, give it the time that it needs.
I 100% agree with
Yeah,
that. I don't think you should like force a feeling or a production of something that's your passion or that feels really intimate to yourself and an idea at the end of the day. Um,
yeah.
what would you say is what would you say makes a great graphic novel in your opinion? Like what are the things that you look for in a good graphic novel or comic?
Yeah, I so for me, and this is a very superficial thing, but like, well, you don't have to be the most realistic artist to make a great comic. But definitely when I know what I'm looking at, it makes it easier for me to understand the story. Given you can be completely abstract and still tell a very compelling story, but if you're going to be abstract, like the that idea has to carry through the whole book. I'm mostly gravitated towards a lot of fantasy.
Hmm.
I like a lot of sci-fi. I like being brought into people's worlds, and it's also something that I like to put into my comics. Like I draw much more in my panels. I draw more than I actually need to draw, which I'm trying to learn to scale back because it takes a long time to draw backgrounds and stuff like that. But I do it because I want people to see exactly what I see in my brain. Like I want people to be brought into the world, and so I appreciate when other people do that. And essentially it's that clarity that I'm looking for. I'm essentially like, um, I think you can make very beautiful work and be abstract. But me personally, like I like being brought into new worlds. So I'm always drawn to stories that have adventures in different locations. I like a and again, this isn't to say these are the best kind of comics. Like there are some really great dramas out there, but I'm not as engaged with dramas. I do like adventures. I like the story to keep taking me from one place to another, and then surprising me with new elements. I like beautiful landscapes. I love drawing like nature and landscapes. There are some fantastic artists. I have a couple on me. Well, it's funny I say that. So here's one. So another dog comic, Atlas and Axis, and like drawn by I think pronounced Pal. But they have this beautiful, like they do these beautiful like landscape drawings.
Wow.
We also have Asterix. Asterix was a big inspiration while I was working on Puppy Night. And then you'll have some. Let me find a really fun one. Like I, I draw a lot of forest scenes, and I don't know. There's just something like you can't draw a tree wrong, even if
Yeah.
you scribble a tree. People will know it's a tree.
Trees are so
So I do
kind.
like, yeah. And then on the more simpler end, and simple doesn't mean bad. We have Moomin, and then like there's some beautiful trees and stuff like that there
Yeah.
too. So I like these worlds a lot, and I think when I look at a comic, I want to be brought into a different world.
Hmm.
Now, sci-fi and fantasy aside, like stuff like Ghost World, um, I'm being brought to a different world, but it's not necessarily because it's just usually like a suburban city. But I'm being brought into a different perspective, and so that's where
Right.
worlds like Day Tripper, Ghost World. What was another one? There's this beautiful book. You can see I have all my stuff over here.
That's
This is probably
awesome.
one of the first books I saw in the library. It's called Three Shadows by Cyril Pedrosa. Uh, very beautiful, very beautiful art.
Wow.
Uh, and it's an adventure. It's got a little bit of fantasy in there, but the aspect that like they're bringing me into a new world, but they're also bringing me into a new perspective. It's kind of the story about a father trying to prevent uh, the uh, the death of his son, and like it was like essentially the fates show up to the father and the mother say, "Hey, your son's gonna die in so many so days," and so the father takes the son and tries to outrun death. And so this is probably one of the besides Day Tripper. I recommend Three Shadows, just because it's a mixture of beautiful worlds, but also like getting into the perspective of a father trying to like stop death.
Yeah. And well, I know that world building is really important to you and adventure is important to you. Um, but what would you say, as opposed to what makes a graphic novel good, in your opinion, what would you say makes a graphic novel successful?
Okay. So in regards to, so I'm very new to the publishing world, but I can tell you kind of the stuff that I've been picking up on recently. So one of the big things is different publishers are looking for specific things, and it's kind of like knowing your audience in that way. So you can't really pitch a detective story if they've never worked with detective stories before, and so um, I think one of the key things that what makes a graphic novel successful is just knowing, because the publisher has to do a lot of that work of putting the book out there and getting it in front of people. So I think knowing your audience in regards to publisher, but also if you're self-publishing, knowing the people who you want to read your books, I think that's what helps make a book successful. It's kind of weird because like with the internet, you can kind of put I mean, it's a great thing. You can put anything out there.
Yeah.
But it's just a matter of like it's unfortunate that you're kind of beholden to places like Instagram or Twitter or Reddit to kind of get people to find your book or find your stories.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I don't know, like compared to like working with a publisher or working within a community where like you know the people or you know what kind of genres you're supposed to be working in, there's no filter for when you throw something out on social media.
Yeah. It's like a
uh,
double-edged sword. Anybody can publish, but then everybody publishes.
yeah. And then when you're in a comics community, you also find an audience there. So what I was gonna get to was that like so I think a lot of what brought success for Puppy Night was not necessarily like posting about it on social media as much as it was Silver Sprocket, showing it to other people, showing it. They do a lot of like behind the scenes stuff of like communicating with other comic book shops, and they're very great advocates for indie comics. So Silver Sprocket as a publisher has been a great help with that. Also, just like getting to know other comic book artists, getting to know other publishers, um, like Michael with his agent. Like, there's so many different things that kind of help push your book in a direction to not necessarily guarantee success, but to align it with the potential of the chance of it taking off.
Right.
I, in general, though, like, I can't tell you the formula of like if your story is going to be like it's going to take off in a certain direction. I think one thing that I've noticed in my experience is consistency, being able to like because I know you post your comics on Webtoons. I was actually checking some of the
Oh,
stuff out,
thanks.
uh, but also people who like consistently post a comic on Twitter or on Instagram. That consistency has built them a lot of like following and an audience. One of the examples that comes to mind is my friend Vince, Crime Guys. So he posts a comic that is about the graffiti community, and so like essentially. Like he's a graffiti artist himself, and so he originally had like a graffiti artist audience, but then he started doing this really great comic, really fun comic that he's crazy consistent with. Like he's always posting it, and like he has this great story and a lot of people who love to read it. And so that's what I would consider a success. Is essentially Michael Sweater once told me like I'd rather have a million readers than $1 million, and that kind of does resonate because like a lot of us do this because we want to share this work.
Right.
I'd love $1 million and a million readers, but
Yeah.
it's kind of nice to be able to have people respond to your work.
You
So
can't have everything.
yeah, but I think consistency is a marking of a successful comic. My friend Gang Fight, he posts a comic on Twitter called Strikeout, and he's very consistent with it, and and that's not his full time job. But he makes time to post like a page a week or something, and people. He has a following for it. There's a readership. So I think consistency is always key.
Right.
Um, Again, that's with self-publishing. But with like, if you want to work with a publisher, you have to know which publishers serve your genre. There's a great podcast called Graphic Novel TK that specifically focuses on the publishing world of graphic novels. So
Oh.
they have far more better advice than I can because I'm still totally new to
I'm
this
sure
world.
that's not true, but we'll definitely check it out. You need to give yourself way more credit, that's for sure. I think that's just something that all artists struggle with, just giving ourselves
Yeah.
credit. But
Yeah, yeah, that happens a lot.
yeah.
Before the recording cut out, I was saying I stopped myself from saying what brought Puppy Night success, and then I was all like, it feels weird to say that Puppy Night is successful, but I have to at least recognize it that
Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, you're making something and it's a reality and people are reading it, and I think that in and of itself is a success
Yeah,
because
I think
it's
that uh, the moment this little girl Olivia did her like third grade book report on my
oh,
comic, on our comic, that was a success
that
for
was
sure.
like peak success
Yes.
right there.
Yeah.
That's adorable. I love that, and it's so heartwarming, and hopefully when people go into something like making graphic novels or comics, which I think is really noble because it's hard to get, I guess, monetary success from it,
Mhm.
that you get those rewards from like human interactions, and human appreciation for your
Yeah.
stories.
Yeah. I think uh, yeah, when people respond to your work, it's always nice to see. But
Yeah.
again, like that's the creative aspect. Now let's look at the editorial and
Yeah.
realistic aspect is that like people do want to make money off of this.
Right.
And essentially like essentially I uh Michael and I, we own Puppy Night 50
Hmm.
but he's the one with the agent, and I feel like I kind of piggybacked on him having an agent. And so like one of my goals for once we're done with Puppy Night and I wanted to explore my own things, like I'm very likely like considering an agent,
Yeah.
just because like they can advocate for you. I like to focus on the process. I like to focus on the art. And part of a lot of people self-publish because they want to own all of it, and that's completely a good route to go. You don't have to give anyone a cut. You can just own your production. You can print, go to shows, sell at table at comic festivals or zine fairs.
Hmm.
If you like that and you can handle that, that's a completely perfect route, and people have been super successful that way. But I just want to draw, and I
Yeah.
don't want to deal with any of the other stuff. And so having an agent to advocate for you, to know what kind of deals to broker, because if you're unfamiliar with like contracts and publishing deals, like it could ownership is a thing that is very important with like where you publish your comics and who you want them to be published with.
Right.
Um, but personally, like I just want to do the drawing and make money off of it.
Hmm.
And so the reality is like, yeah, it's good to have a professional that can kind of help, advocate for you, connect you with publishers that would work with your work.
I also
Um,
think, and I think I've heard this a lot, that it is easier for you to get your foot in the door with publishers if you have an agent. It's a little bit harder for them to take you seriously or even to pay attention to you if you don't come in with an agent. Would you say that's
yeah,
true?
Yeah, I think even like, and especially like in my personal experience with like not even in comics but also in design, like essentially like getting to know people and like having people that can advocate for you, like it removes so many barriers. And it's unfortunate, but like y- you you kind of have to start like if you haven't reached out to people, if you haven't gotten to know other cartoonists, or you I mean, some people can't make it to public events for personal or health reasons.
Yeah.
Reach out online. Essentially, try to get to know as many people. Get them to like. You don't want to force your work onto them, but like if you're putting work out somewhere, people will see it. But you want to be able to spread your net out, to kind of like uh, basically like I've been a designer for most of my career so far compared to a comic book artist. So maybe some of these examples won't really work, but maybe they could. But like as soon as like I got laid off from my first design job, and everybody else that I used to work with started finding their own jobs everywhere else. They were whenever like there was an opening on their job, they always reached out to me.
Yeah.
And like that was like a web that like really helped out, because like if I ever needed a design job, it was just kind of like, okay, cool, like they know the work that I do already, and it's about exposing other people to the work that you can do and the kind of person that you are. Nobody wants to work with an asshole.
Yeah.
So it's always in your benefit to be kind to people, and to just just know that like that you can find nice people out there. Gatekeeping is something that I haven't been exposed to, thankfully, but I know it exists. I think I think it's you just don't want to be involved with anybody who's going to keep you away from um, anything creative.
Yeah.
Gatekeeping is extremely stupid. It's just like when you're working in a creative field, like mine's the limit, like sky's the limit, and it's just like, how can you gatekeep something that like we're making up in our own brains?
Yeah.
Like it
It's
doesn't make sense. But like again, the reality part of it is like some people are um, they're the decision makers of like whether you get published or not.
yeah.
Again, I don't have too much experience about that's really like. I just know that it does exist. And there's definitely ways to get into this industry that can avoid all that. But you have to you have to put yourself out there, and it can be really hard. It can be
Yeah.
really hard to meet other people and kind of expose yourself a little bit. But it is worth it. Take your time. I know some people. Like I have friends that are like they have anxiety about this stuff, and it's totally understandable. Um, I always tell them like you don't lose anything with an email. It's a good enough barrier that
Yeah.
you can introduce yourself and not have to worry too much.
I think it's super important to put yourself out there, and but also I think a lot of people focus a lot on like reaching out to people, but it is important to do it in a way that feels genuine and that is genuine. You know, you want to create connections because you truly want to connect with somebody and not just because you're seeing a benefit to that relationship.
Yeah.
And I think a
Eh,
lot of people forget that.
yeah. It's also good to consider boundaries.
Hmm.
Just because like I've had uh I have people reach out and like I essentially like uh the one of the big problems with social media is like parasocial relationships.
Yes.
And essentially like unless like I've gotten to know you for a couple years and like we have a rapport, um be careful not to overstep boundaries that other people might not be comfortable with. So like introduce yourself in an email, tell them like show them the kind of work, or have a reason for why you have an email. You don't want to just be like, hey, I'm a cartoonist. Here's my work, and then like I don't know what to do with it. But like if you have something actionable, like hey, like I'm trying to get better at drawing comics, or do you have that have a question maybe? That kind of helps set the expectation of what the communication is. But yeah, don't never feel like you're entitled to anyone's time. Oh,
Yeah.
it doesn't hurt to ask, but don't expect a friend like a friendship right away or
Right.
something.
I mean, I don't think that's how it works even in real life, so why would it
Yeah,
work online, right?
yeah.
And finally, what advice would you give yourself, your younger self, when it comes to, working on a comic? What would you tell your younger self that you perhaps know now that you didn't know before?
Definitely like allow mistakes to happen, and don't get hung up on mistakes. And so this is something that I'm still learning now, and like this is this you can say that for like emotional mistakes, but also like with the actual work. Like recently, I deactivated the undo tab on my Procreate
Oh,
because when you work digitally, it's so easy to undo a stroke.
yeah.
And I grew up with parents who always wanted me to write very neatly, and that stuck with me. And I realized it was holding me back with my output on drawing pages because I would spend. Uh, there's a story with the first Puppy Night book where I redrew the same panel 3 times even though Mike said it looked great the first time. And you kind of get have to like you have to move past a lot of like little mistakes and things that really don't add up. And people are really only looking at your panels for a few seconds at a time, unless they're other comic book artists. Other comic book artists will
Yeah.
look at your art inside and out. But if you're expanding to other readers, like they're gonna read your book and they're not gonna notice if that one line is just slightly over the other one or if it's not perfectly cleaned up. And so I started I started doing this practice where I undo less. And if I need to really fix something, and again, I work digitally primarily, use the erase tool and scrub it out rather than undoing a whole line, because it does add up. All that time adds up. All the undos add up,
Of course.
and at least for me personally, all that undoing comes from a place of like, oh, it's not perfect, it's not perfect. But often like comic book art always looks great when it's like it's organic and natural. And so allow yourself to make mistakes. Don't be so hard on yourself, because I'm always very hard on myself. It's Yeah, just know that like there's no right way of doing any of this. So why punish yourself for doing something naturally?
Of course. I mean, I agree for sure. Sometimes just that expectation of doing things perfectly can really hold you back because you're just so focused on that that you don't even enjoy the process of what you're doing.
Yeah.
And certainly
And
something that I struggle with.
I would also add, and also like being nicer to yourself. Again, I have the privilege of being able to like set like work hours for me making comics. Some people are working on comics after their day jobs, and like that's the only time they can find. But I would tell my younger self like, stop banging your head against the wall when like you're struggling with a page, because you're gonna just keep grinding down at like your mental health. So like I used to, my working hours used to be, um, like working late until like 2, 3 in the morning. And then this is for me personally, what I learned is that, as you go throughout your day, you're just using so much energy, mental energy or physical energy, that like if you keep going out into the late hours, you're just wringing your brain dry. So what I started doing instead is like started going to sleep at a better time, like 10 p.m. And then just getting up early, because at least you're sleeping, like you're refreshing your brain, and then like it's the same time that you're spending working late hours, but you're just doing it earlier when you're actually refreshed and you've gotten sleep. There's a lot of horror stories of just kind of like, people like, we had a lot of great artists pass away, potentially from overwork.
Yeah.
And so it's just one of those things that like you be mindful of your health too.
Hmm.
There is more to life than comics. Uh,
Yes.
so it's just kind of like, take care of yourself, for sure.
Yeah, burnout is a real thing, and I think it can be really detrimental to your mental health and your physical health. And I mean, I have friends who, just because of burnout, they stopped drawing altogether because
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
too bad. And I don't think anybody wants to be in a position like that.
yeah.
So I think those are really great. It's great advice. I think it's so cool to hear different perspectives from other artists and because even though everybody's online and we're always posting things, sometimes that element of like having the conversation is lost in the social media interactions. So I just, want to thank you so much for just telling me all of this information is
Yeah, of
really
course.
valuable. And it's, I guess comics are not new to me specifically, but trying to find publishers and like making a graphic novel is something that's new to me. And so it
Yeah.
is nice to know like people who are actually working on things that are getting published and
Yeah.
asking you guys questions
Yeah,
basically.
and especially like, I'm still dipping my toes into this, so it's kind of like, consider like my experience like a bridge to,
Yeah.
um, somebody who has been working with publishers for a long time.
Which is also really cool because sometimes when people have been working on things like that for a long time, perhaps some things become normalized or they don't really think
Sure,
about them that much. So you
sure.
don't get that, uh, you're just not on the same part of the journey, I guess. So it's
Yeah,
hard to relate to some things.
yeah.
But it's really cool that you're like just beginning, and I'm sure there's so much more to come for you with your work. I love your work. Your work is so cool. You have such
Oh,
a
I appreciate it. Thank you.
specific style. Um, it's just really, I don't know. It honestly doesn't even feel like, and I mean this in the best way possible, like you're a perfectionist. It just means it just feels like it flows, you know? It's kind of like I imagine you just doodling and like having a great time and just like
Yeah, it's it's taken, again, like it's taken a while to feel that way.
hmm.
That like I'm just doodling and having fun.
Yeah.
But then like when you're overthinking every stroke, you're not having fun. Your brain needs to relax. And when you reach that point where you can forgive yourself and allow your brain to relax while you're drawing, it gets much better.
Yeah.
The burnout is way less.
And I also really love, I do see that really heavy influence with games in your drawings,
Hmm.
which is really
Yeah.
cool because a lot of people, like, everybody has inspirations from different places, but I don't think, me personally, I have met many artists who have such a, like, heavy inspiration background from games.
Yeah, a lot of the curves and like because when you start drawing a lot, like you have muscle memory with some shapes, and
Hmm.
a lot of those shapes come from like drawing Mario's gloves,
Yeah.
or like a smile from excuse me, a smile from like a Steven Universe or something like
Hmm.
that. Like I
That's
think
super
there's
cool.
a this is a quick aside, but like there's a lot of there's like a lot of Twitter debate about like using reference or like how you derive your own art style. And like honestly, like if you're inspired by a work, I 100% think that fan art is a great way to develop your art style and find the things that you like to do. And then just because anything that comes out of your hand, like it's going to be a completely different interpretation
Yeah.
of what it is. Again, bringing it back to design, there was I forget what type designer, but there's this one designer who like their process for developing a new font is to try to redraw existing fonts from memory, and then the little variations of that memory is what defines a completely new typeface.
Wow.
So uh, professionals are doing it. Professionals are remixing.
Yeah.
Professionals are learning from other people's work. So why can't you?
Exactly. Everything is like a copy of a copy of a copy, but
Yeah,
like it's just it'll never be the same if it's not made by the same person. So
yeah,
I love
exactly.
that.